My name is Teresa Dickinson. I'm Deputy Statistician at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and I have the great privilege and joy of being the Senior Responsible Officer for the 2021 Census. In terms of immediate personal introductions, I'd also like to introduce Melissa and Andrea, who will be our two Auslan interpreters today. I and the ABS respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of all the lands and nations we are currently standing on and acknowledge their rich traditional culture. For those of us here in Canberra, this is the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge the continued connection to land, waters and communities of our traditional owners and custodians and extend my respect to their continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices. I also extend that respect to elders past, present and emerging and thank them for looking after the lands we live on. I offer respect and especially heartfelt welcome to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders present today. This is NAIDOC Week, which provides a focused time to celebrate, acknowledge and honour achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the theme for NAIDOC Week this year is Get Up, Stand Up and Show Up, and provides the opportunity to acknowledge the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've been champions of change across areas, including fighting for equal and basic human rights. I'm both proud and sad to acknowledge the significance of the 2021 census for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The 2021 census marks the 50th anniversary of the 1971 census, when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were fully included in census results for the first time. I'm proud because 50 years is a significant milestone that we have been counting Indigenous people and finding out information about them through the census, but I'm sad because it took so long for proper counting and recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be included in the census, and of course required the 1967 referendum for that to be possible. In the 2021 census, 800,000 people were identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, and we'll be sharing some interesting facts and figures about how and why that number's changing. We worked hard to make the census easy for all people in Australia to complete, and the census was supported by many members and leaders in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, including media outlets such as NITV and First Nations media, who shared key information on our behalf in language, Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations who helped our census staff enter communities safely during COVID, and many, many local organisations and communities who worked with us to help people complete their census form, whether that was through an interview situation or providing help to others to actually complete their form. And we're very grateful to these organisations and others for their support of the census. So the purpose of this seminar is to help provide 2021 census data back to you, users in the community. Our tagline for the census was, "Every stat tells a story," and this is your data, your stats, and we're now going to share some of its stories. And you'll develop many more, and we hope that the data will support you making decisions about your life, your families, your communities, and your country. Today we're going to share some of the highlights from the 2021 census about how our population is growing, how our cultural diversity continues to change, and the makeup of Australian households today. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce the speakers for today's seminar, and I'll do this all at once before moving to our first speaker. We have Frank Quinlan, who is Federation Executive Director of the Royal Flying Doctor Service in Australia. And after a 3-minute video, Frank's going to talk to us about how census data is crucial to health service provision for his organisation. Duncan Young will then speak. He's General Manager of the Census at the ABS, and he's going to provide key insights into Australia's population and generational changes. Mark Harding, Program Manager for the 2021 Census Data Operations, Bureau of Statistics, will cover some insights about cultural diversity and data on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Caroline Deans, who is Director of Census Data Dissemination, will cover insights from dwellings, families and our new census topics. And we're really pleased that for the first time we're able to provide information on long-term health conditions and service with the Australian Defence Force. Through the journey from designing the questions on the census form to reviewing the final data findings, I try to keep in mind how this information helps inform important decisions and planning for government and community services in rural and remote regions, and right across Australia. And I've often said to the team that the value of their hard work only accrues once the data is out there being used and value created through better decision making. And so we're really proud that this week is the week that starts with the 2021 census data. As one very clear example of this, we're going to turn to the Royal Flying Doctor Service. And as you'll hear today, the RFDS provides emergency medical and primary health services to those areas that do not have access. And I'm really glad that the data collected in the census helps inform this important service. The RFDS have been avid users and staunch supporters of the census, and we featured a case study about how they used the census data as part of our campaign last year. So I'm delighted that Frank is here in person to showcase more about how census data supports the Royal Flying Doctor Service in their incredibly important and iconic work. So after the little video shows, it's my real pleasure to welcome Frank and to talk about the RFDS and how they use census data. So in just a few moments, we'll welcome Frank.
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be part of this gathering today. And I must say it was an opportunity that I leapt at when the opportunity presented itself, because as I'll say, we really do believe ourselves to be intricate partners with the ABS in some of our work, and I hope to tell some of that story today. I begin by joining your acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered here, the Ngunnawal country, but in all the vast places across this country of ours. I also wanted to do a little experiment that's going to backfire on me one day, but hopefully not today. We often ask people to turn off their phones. I'm going to ask you to turn it on or to take it out if you can. And some of you will be able to, if your data plans are up to date, be able to just do a quick search that says RFDS flight map. I'll let you do that yourselves, but as I did it just while I was sitting there, knowing that it won't go too far wrong, I actually counted 16 aircraft in the air as we speak, as we're sitting here right now. And I often say to gatherings like this, that's at least 16 people and probably more who could be having a very bad day. It's 16 pilots, it's numerous medical crews and teams, it's engineering teams, it's volunteers, it's people who've possibly donated those aircraft to our cause. It's a very important story and it's a live one. We often think of the RFDS, certainly before I became involved, I thought of the RFDS, we call it swoop and scoop, jumping in for the odd accident or odd serious illness. It's, as you saw from the video, a massive operation. And as I stand here today, I just am acutely aware I stand here on behalf of a whole lot of people who are involved in that work all the time. But it's real work and it's happening now, and it really does affect people's lives. And in that context, my main theme for the day is to really particularly acknowledge the ABS teams, and I don't know many of them or even the extent of all that work and all that operation and where it is, but I really want to convey the sense that in our work, the work that you're doing is tremendously important. The RFDS has been working for 94 years now, more than 94 years, developing services. And from our beginnings, we were both a practical service, but also an innovative service. So we saw Alfred Traeger's pedal radio in 1920, very early form of telemedicine, often not recognised. And we actually rented a plane from Qantas in 1928 and conducted our first medical flight. We've come a long way since then, and as you see from this map, we have a huge national footprint. So 23 bases across the country spread out, and please note that it's as far south as Tassie, as far north as the Cape, and east and west as well. We like to say that we're Australia's third biggest airline, behind Qantas and Virgin, but I'm more and more inclined to say these days, and especially having experienced in the last couple of weeks, we don't lose your baggage and we get away on time pretty regularly. So I don't know if we need to be having another chat to Qantas about the future of that. In addition to that, there's a whole raft of dental health, mental health, primary health services, and as we say, it's that primary health work which, if done well and done extensively, can help us save people from what is frankly often a very expensive retrieval. So if you're very ill and you need to be transported from a remote location to a tertiary hospital, it's a very expensive undertaking. It's specialised equipment, specialised crews, time-critical work. And we just increasingly try and convey the message that if we're able to invest properly in primary health care and particularly preventative care, there's probably a lot of that work that could be avoided. I think the economics of that make perfect sense. Our daily sort of operations are spread right across the country, so once again we're not entirely restricted to the outback. We really are focused on people who one way or another will miss out on medical services if they're not provided either via us or in partnership with us. And I'll talk a little bit more about that sense of partnership in a moment. Getting to the story of the census data, really, and I hope to give a little illustration of that I think is very clear. Our planning is critical and frankly life-changing, so we are constantly in a process of trying to evaluate where our services are pre-deployed to, what sorts of teams we might need, what sorts of operations we might need to operate. As I said, an extensive network provides a blanket of protection, a mantle of protection for people living in remote locations so that people are able to be retrieved in emergency circumstances. But a whole raft of other activity plans a series of primary health clinics and other activities each year that means we can reach into those communities, either directly ourselves often in partnership with Aboriginal medical services, with local primary health networks and local health districts and others, to touch people who would otherwise miss out on services. And to get to that a little bit about how that's expressed. So we have a tool, we call it internally the Service Planning and Operational Tool, the SPOT tool. It produced this map. And we drop into that tool all of the data that you're able to give us, as regularly as you're able to give us. And I know we're reaching out to you all the time with special requests and so forth. But because we can drop that data into our operational planning tool, we're able to do a much more effective job of planning our services efficiently. In that tool, we're able, and we published a report on this last year, we recognise that using the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's 1 hour drive rule, which is arbitrary, how many people can drive to a service within an hour, 65,000 Australians are not within an hour's drive of a GP or a GP clinic. 440,000 Australians are not within an hour's drive of a nursing clinic. 142,000 Australians are not within an hour's drive of a dental clinic. And similar numbers, just short, are not within a drive of mental health services and programs. We know that telehealth and telemedicine provide us with massive potential in terms of delivering services, but we also know that they're not an adequate substitute for some of the face-to-face programs that we need to have. I wanted to talk briefly about our COVID response because I think it illustrates just how important to us the ABS data and other data has been. At the beginning of the COVID crisis, which is a couple of years ago now, and I think we need to sort of cast our minds back in a way to just remind ourselves how terrified we were. It was unknown. It was a pandemic that was sweeping the world. We didn't know entirely what the impacts were going to be. And there were some very dark days of planning that took place. I remember being involved in meetings talking about how we could potentially need to be setting up field hospitals in remote aerodromes because tertiary hospitals would be full and we'd have planes with patients on them and nowhere to take them. So casting into that environment, how do you plan services that are effective? What we did, as I said, was analyse some of your data, analyse some of our own data. That allowed us to very quickly paint two pictures. The first picture we created was a picture that said, what has respiratory distress looked like over the last 5 years? And we were able to create a picture that said, look, here are the principal pockets of our retrievals over the last 5 years. Here are the pockets of population where respiratory distress was high. And it immediately created a hot map, if you like, that said, in the face of a global pandemic of a respiratory illness, straight away, here are some places that we think are likely to be at very high risk. Here are the comorbidities that go with them. And so on the back of that, we were able to identify in our very first tranche 25 communities that we thought were both particularly at high risk and a long way away from other help. And we were able to take that message to government straight away, who supported us in our endeavours, and we were able to deliver vaccine services, we were able to ready respiratory clinics, we were able to plan retrieval services as they might be required. And that had a huge impact on the eventual outcome, I think, of our COVID response. In the end, it grew, as we know. The tide of distress was not as severe as we anticipated it might have been, thank heavens, but the scale of the illness was much greater probably than we anticipated, and I think over this next surge that we're likely to see in the next little while, we're going to see that more. So in the end, we ended up providing some 200 respiratory clinics across the country. We've so far provided 3,000 aeromedical retrievals of people either COVID positive or strongly suspected of being COVID positive. We've provided some 3,000 or more road transports of people, again, similarly in COVID distress. We're now at 80,000 Australians that we've vaccinated directly, and I might tell you, if you're picking people off sometimes 5 and 10 and 20 at a time in very small communities, that's a massive undertaking. But again, with support of the Australian government, we've been able to achieve that. In addition to that, and I think this is one of the key learnings of the COVID crisis, we also in some measure operated as a simple logistics company. So you can't just call Toll Holding and DHL and have them deliver vaccines out to Rowena Station. Our services were on the ground, and so some of our services were straight logistical services that nonetheless allowed some more than 100,000 additional vaccinations to be delivered by others. So to be delivered by Aboriginal medical services in community-controlled organisations or other practices in the bush. So, as I said, my core message for today is that whilst I think we can celebrate that response, we can celebrate the fact that some of those, the degree of illness wasn't as bad as we anticipated right at the beginning, we should never forget that our ability to plan our response was built on data from the beginning. And if we as a country, if we as a service lose that capability, we'll be flying blind into the next pandemic, and we'll be flying blind into a lot of our planning services. So to the ABS staff who've been part of that, I really just want to say thank you. You were an intricate part of our response to the global pandemic, and we really look forward to working on these kinds of data gathering exercises and data analysing exercises into the future, because they really do make a difference in people's lives. Thanks.
Wow, thank you, Frank. I'm going to go back to the office today and ask all of my staff to watch a replay of that presentation. It's quite so important to us to know how our data is used and the value of that data, and it makes me even more excited about the fact that this census we were able to include questions on health conditions for the first time ever, and our first new questions in over 20 years. And so really looking forward to revisiting with you in the future how that information can really help as we go forward. Everyone, I'm Duncan Young, as Teresa said earlier, General Manager of a Census program at the ABS. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you and to talk to you a little bit about the Census program and start sharing some of the data from the Census program. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are traditional owners of the lands here. I'd also like to shout out for, I know there will be people watching this stream from my hometown of Hobart, so acknowledge the Palawa people, the traditional owners there, and also the traditional owners right across the country. So Census program is what I'll talk about first, and how we conducted the census during the pandemic, and also the key quality measures of this census, so that you can really understand the data that you're getting from this census. And then we'll get into the stuff which will get us really excited and out of our seats as we start unpacking some of the data insights from the census, and then talk about the extra releases and more things to come in the future. So we will have time at the end, though, for a set of questions today. So if we use this service quite a bit at the ABS, it's a really great way of us gathering questions together. If people go on their phone or their computer to www.pollev.com/2021 Census NDS, as it's represented on the slide, you'll be able to submit your questions in there. And then those questions will be the ones we'll use to sort of answer at the end of the session. So you can put questions in there at any time. That URL will be up on the slides during the session, so you'll get plenty of reminders of that, hoping to get a whole lot of questions. A little bit of an admission, I am a bit of what we call at the ABS a census junkie. Like I've been able to work on censuses now in about I think 6 or 7 different countries and worked on a number of censuses in Australia. And censuses are quite hard. They're really big operations, but they're quite exciting and fun. But as this slide shows up here, some of the numbers from a census last year, the scale of the operations and logistics, Australia's largest peacetime home operation. I'll call out, we recruited a new staff member for census last year. It was our first ever chatbot. Claire, the chatbot, who was a typical Australian, and she had 375 conversations about the census, probably only rivalling me for 2021 in terms of census conversations. She did a great job of supporting the census. 10 million kilometres our lovely 35,000 field staff did as part of collecting the census. So there were some 25 laps around the equator of the earth and quite a few tax claims, I reckon, coming up with their tax returns at the moment. So census is a big operation and something, but it takes, we're about 7 years from the start of a census to the end of a census. And we do a census every 5 years in Australia, so we're starting the next census before we've finished the last. It's sort of a continual kind of process. And the census in 2021 had the unique challenge of running a census during a global pandemic. And we really must say, Jade, winding back to 2020 when Frank was doing the critical things around planning the health services for the nation, we were doing the critical worrying about what this would mean for running a national operation like the census program. And but actually, it's turned out really well. And I don't want to sort of say that the pandemic obviously hasn't turned out very well, and it's a really terrible thing for a nation. But from a census point of view, it actually created an environment that's given us what we think is probably the most complete census data set we've ever collected. So the second Tuesday in August, and apologies for anyone tuned in who it's the birthday of today, and so it's probably 5 or 6 of you based on the numbers. But the second Tuesday in August is one of the most boring days in Australia, and that's why we choose it to run the census. People are likely to be at home. People are likely, it's not a public holiday, it's not school holidays. People are likely to be at home, which means that we get a picture of Australia in its most sort of normal kind of state, where people are at home, families are together, households are together. And what we saw during the census, sadly, was that half the country at different stages during the census were in lockdown. And so we actually saw lots more people at home than we've ever seen before, which is why we know it's such a complete kind of data set. So in 2016, was 600,000 of us travelling overseas at census time, and so they don't fill out their census form. We add them back in for population estimates, but we don't get that rich census data. There's only 50,000 overseas last year, so 550,000 back in. And in fact, the number of people in the country, less were travelling for work, less were travelling in domestically, so more people were at their home. So a really nice complete data set. We did see less overseas visitors in Australia, and so some of the data is different. And in tourist areas, particularly when you look at the census night count compared to the usual residence count. So the usual residence count where we usually live, it will be the same, comparable census to census, but the census night count, some of those will be different where people haven't got to tourism areas. Also, we did see a few other kind of changes in the data. We saw less volunteering reported in the census, and we think that might be a COVID impact. So in the 12 months leading up to a census, it was a bit harder for people to get out and volunteer in the community than other times, and hopefully we'll see that sort of bounce back come 2026. But overall, the census during a pandemic was one which has produced really high quality data for us. So 96.1% response rate from a census. That's an amazing figure. Globally, it's a great figure for Australia. It's higher than our targets and higher than what we achieved in 2016. A 0.7% net undercount. So we go through a lot of statistical processes. We run another survey after a census to check who we've missed in the census, and that's the count of a percentage of population, but we've managed to miss is in the final count from a census. 0.7% is the lowest net undercount we've ever seen in an Australian census. So it's a very complete data set. We also saw this continual movement to online. So 78.9% of Australians completed the census online, which actually, the census online, what we've seen since we first introduced the census online in 2006 is we get better data through the online form. It helps take people to the right questions, but don't accidentally skip questions they need to answer or answer questions they don't have to. It guides people through the process. So we end up with a richer, nicer data set. So really pleased with the data set we've got from his census, and our independent assurance panel have come out with very complimentary comments about the quality of the data and the use of this data. Enough preamble though, let's get you excited with some census data, and we're going to start by talking about the people of Australia. So this census counted 25,422,788 people, excluding overseas visitors. So first time we've counted over 25 million people in Australia. And so that's an 8.6% increase on 2016. So not quite as big an increase as the 5 years before that, but it's still a very significant growth in that period of time. And as you can see from the bottom of that slide, our population has now more than doubled since 1971 in Australia. And so we now make up 0.3% of a world population. Okay, that doesn't sound that impressive, but this census data set does have 100% of us in it, and that's why we're excited about it, and that's why we're talking about it today. So let's dig down a little bit, a layer below this kind of national figures in terms of the population to see how the population's changed from a sort of state and territory basis. And so this slide represents the percentage change from a population in each of our states and territories across Australia. And so here in the ACT, 14.4% increase, one of the biggest increases we've seen in a census period for a state or territory. The biggest one we saw this time, and that's twice in a row now the ACT has been the fastest growing state or territory in the country. So really booming here in the ACT in terms of population growth. We saw Victoria with the second fastest growth, again, 2 censuses in a row, but quite a way back from the ACT. And a bit of a call out for my home state of Tasmania, 9.3% growth, fastest growth we've seen in a Tasmanian census since 1961. So a really fast growth there in Tasmania. NT is a bit of a best kept secret in Australia in the last 5 years, so at the other end of our growth at 1.6%. And obviously all the other countries, or not countries, states and territories landing in between. Now, this picture is really interesting. This one shows those in the red, the population growth in each of those state and territories. So the same picture we saw on the previous slide, but what we run in Australia is a census of population and housing. And the green lines show the dwelling change between 2016 and 2021. And so what's sort of interesting there is that in some states, so New South Wales and Victoria, which had a bit of slower growth than they'd seen the 5 years prior, have actually had more dwelling growth than they've had population growth within the last 5 years. Whereas South Australia and Tasmania, which are both accelerated in growth, have had more population growth than they've had dwelling growth in the last 5 years. Now, there's always a little bit of interest, particularly when you go to Melbourne and Sydney, actually particularly when you go to Melbourne, about when will we catch up to Sydney and become the biggest city in the country. Sorry for people in Melbourne, Sydney's being a little bit stubborn here. If we go back to 2001, there was about a 300,000 person gap between Melbourne and Sydney. And whilst Melbourne is proportionately growing more, it's still maintaining this 300,000 person gap. And so as you can see here over the last 3 lines, as a percentage terms, Melbourne is nearly as big as Sydney, but there's no sort of rapid takeover here story, so not breaking that story today. Now, this is where statisticians get really excited, and I need to try and bring you along on the journey here. This is what's called an age-sex pyramid. And an age-sex pyramid shows the proportion of a population that's at a different age group. And so, and on one side here you've got males, and the other side you've got females. And this is a picture of Australia in 2001, just after the turn of a millennium. And you can see that the 40 to 44-year-olds are sort of the biggest group in the country. There's more people who are 40 to 44 than any other age. Obviously, we get less people as we get older. You can see the differences. There's a higher proportion of females in the 85 plus. Females live longer than males. And so you can sort of see this kind of picture. And by looking at an age-sex pyramid, you can sort of look at how the country is ageing and how the country is changing over time. And so we'll overlay on top of that the age-sex pyramid of 2021. And what you can see is some green lines popping out further up the picture there. So that's our baby boomers as they get older. And that's why Australia overall is ageing more as a country. But we can actually see in the green there some of the bigger age groups now in the country are in our millennial age group, your 30 to 34-year-olds and your 25 to 29-year-olds. So a bit of a changing kind of shape of the age profile in Australia, which has led to one of the stories which has probably gathered some of the biggest interest from this census, which is the story of some of the generational groups in the country. And so we've divided the census up into these generational groups, and according to social media, there are many different definitions, apparently, of exactly when a generational group starts and finishes, but these are the ones we've used for the purpose of analysis. And what we saw in this census was millennials as a generational group caught up to the baby boomers, which was yet quite a notable kind of moment, because the baby boomers, when they had sort of finished being born, and as a group, they made up nearly 2 in 5 of the population, nearly 40% of the Australian population. And since that point in time have been the biggest cohort in our age profile as they've got older and older in the country. And so it wasn't until, and even back in 2016, there were still 500,000 more baby boomers than there were millennials in the country. So this gap's closed quite quickly to this point. And what we can see now is that actually, the baby boomers are starting to decline slightly, but not much. There's not a big decline yet in the baby boomer size, but the millennial group is still growing, because the millennial group also is the prime age for people which are migrating into Australia. So new migrants are often in the millennial group. And so a really interesting kind of change there. And so let's have a look at a few different views of what the millennial group and the baby boomer group and the other generations, and what are some of the different characteristics of these groups, which will tease on a little bit of a content that my colleagues will get into some more detail on in a minute. Well, first, if we look at our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, you've got quite a different age profile compared to non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So it's a much younger population group. So there's actually more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. They make up a bigger proportion of the Gen Alphas than they do of the other age groups. And so the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population have a median age of 24, which is increasing, has increased since the last census, compared to 38 for the whole population. And a large component of this that you'll see later on is a significant number of new people being born on who are identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Our countries of birth between the generations change between the different generations. In every generation, Australian-born is the biggest group. And probably unsurprisingly, in the youngest age group, it's the biggest. It's about 90% of the Gen Alphas were born in Australia. But then, as we get into the millennials, the Gen Xers and the baby boomers and the interwars, it's about 60% of that age group were born in Australia, and about 40% were migrants. What we can see in this picture here is that if you go to the interwar or generation, the oldest generation, you've got the Italian and Greek born on communities, and England is very prominent from Gen X older, whereas in the millennials and younger, Indian born population make up a bigger share of those generations. And the Chinese born actually make this sort of top 5 list across every group except the interwar kind of group. Religious affiliation is something which also has quite a bit of difference from generation to generation. And so as you'll hear a little bit later on, we've seen this declining number of people declaring the census a Christian religion, and more people declaring no religion, and also more people declaring other religion. And you can see here some quite big differences where in the baby boomers cohort, there is a very high proportion of indicated Christianity, more than half of all people in the baby boomer category, and only 30% indicating no religion. Whereas if we zoomed in on the millennials, there's about 30% Christian, nearly 50% reporting no religion, and about 15% reporting other religions. And so, as you'll hear later on, as through migration, we're seeing an increase in people all with religions: Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism. And then another view, looking at generations, are dwelling tenure. So this is about the home that you're in on census night. And was that home owned outright? Was that home owned with a mortgage, or was that home rented? And so just because you're in that home doesn't mean that you are necessarily the person who owns the house outright. And so there's not a lot of 10 to 24-year-olds which are owning their homes outright. They're probably the children of people in the Gen X kind of group. And also, obviously, there's people in shared homes and different arrangements. But clearly here, there's a really big proportion in the baby boomers that have owned their homes outright, and in the millennial group at the moment, it's a very small proportion of own their homes outright, and a greater proportion are in the rented kind of category at this stage. Enough from me. I'll hand over to Mark Harding.
Thank you very much, Duncan. We decided to split this up between a few different speakers to try and keep people interested and engaged and listen to different voices, but I think we all could have just listened to how excited Duncan is about the census data for a long time, so thank you, Duncan, it's good. I'd also like to add my acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of this land, the Ngunnawal people, and also all the lands that people are dialing in from around the country, and also I'll mention the Darawal-speaking people of south of Sydney, where I'm from. So we will take a look at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data from the census now. So that's what we're moving on to, and I'll talk a bit about the big picture first. We have, I think Teresa mentioned it, and we counted over 800,000 people who identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in the 2021 census, and that's 3.2% of the total population. That's a 25% increase from the last census, and you can see on this slide that there was an 18% increase between 2011 and 2016. So we're going to dive into a bit more detail about these numbers now, but I do want to do a bit of a shout out for the seminar coming up on Monday next week. The ABS Centre for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Statistics is running a focused seminar on these statistics, on this theme, and details of that are on our website, and Caroline's going to cover that and some other sessions that we'll be running later in the presentation. So moving on, I'll move that up, make sure it clicks, there you go. So I'll try to keep you with me as I go through these slides, but I want to make sure we cover all the content and still have time for questions. So this is really to show you that large increases aren't unusual. We do see these sorts of increases in the number of people who identify as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander between censuses, and we've seen that since 1971. This is one of the largest though, noting an increase between 91 and 96, which actually isn't on the slide, of about 33%, which was the largest that we've seen, but this is one of the larger ones at 25%. And we do look into these increases and try to understand the components. After the 2016 census, we did some analysis that showed much of the increase was explainable due to demographic factors like births. However, the remainder is explained more by changes in how people identify between censuses and the changes in the cohort who identify between censuses. And that's something that's really important to keep in mind, because if a cohort changes, then some of the changes that you see in the data are actually because different people are included in that group, not because the people that we were looking at and seeing in the previous census have actually changed. So that is something that's really important to keep in mind, and we will repeat that analysis for the 2021 census to understand those components, but we need a bit more data that we're releasing later in the year from the census and other things, so that actually doesn't come out until probably early next year, where we'll understand more about that. I will keep moving on. So diving in a little bit deeper to the counts and what we've seen across the cohort in 2021. Of the 800,000 people who identified as having Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin, the vast majority identified as Aboriginal only, so almost 750,000 or about 91% of this group. And that's also where we saw most of the increase. So it's about a 26% increase in that group. Much slower growth in the Torres Strait Islander group, however, still some growth there, and quite a significant growth in the both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander group there of about 9,000 people, and that's a similar pattern to what we've seen in the previous census, although it is a faster growth, and that's about a 35% increase there. So moving into state and territory, and we will try and give just a bit of, it's a national seminar, but we'll try and dive a bit into the states and just show how things can change as you look at different parts of the country. So there's an increase in older, oh sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. That's not the age one yet. So we have, here we are. We continue to see that most of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are living in both New South Wales and Queensland. That's about 2/3 of the whole Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. And we also continue to see, although it's not on this slide, that most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live outside of capital cities rather than in them, and that's different to what we see in the overall Australian population. Another thing to note here is that while less than 8% of Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population live in the Northern Territory, it is just over 1/4 of the Northern Territory's population who identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. You can see on this slide that the growth isn't the same across the country. So New South Wales has maintained a similar growth, but every other state and territory has seen a much larger increase from what we saw in 2011 to 2016. And Victoria and the ACT are both very high at around 37% increases. So this one, try and explain what we're looking at here so people can stay with me. But we've got basically counts of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people by each of the last 3 censuses, so the red line being the 2021 census, by age, whether they're living inside capital cities or outside capital cities. So what we can really see here is some of the drivers, and even though we do need to unpack more about the components of who's identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, we can see some information and what might be happening in that growth. So there's definitely an increase in children and young people, and that's really obvious on both sides, inside capital cities and out. And that's likely a combination of demographic factors as well as people identifying not just for themselves but for their families and their children. And as we move up through the ages, we can see, again, likely combinations of those demographic factors, but also people potentially moving into capital cities and more people identifying at different age groups that didn't identify in the previous 2 censuses. So here we have the age, and Duncan already referred to this in the generation slides, but we do just see this increase in the ageing population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. The median age for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population is now 24, which is up from 21 in 2011, which is reflected on this slide, but also 23 from the 2016 census. So while there was a 25% increase in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population overall, we do see a much bigger increase, a faster increase in the people aged 65 years and over. And you can see this distribution has shifted towards the older brackets. So again, this data will include people both who have aged from the 2011 cohort into those older brackets, as well as potentially people identifying for the first time. And I do just again mention that if people want more information on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander results from the census, that we'll be doing that seminar on Monday next week and going into more detail here. So please check it out online and register for that if you're interested. I am going to move on now, though, to cultural diversity and have a look at some of the census results for our diverse communities across Australia. So this slide you may have already seen in some of the things we've put on the website already and through our launch, but it's really just a high-level slide showing that Australia is diverse. So first-generation people who were born overseas themselves, second-generation people who have at least one parent born overseas, and then third-generation and beyond people who have been settled in Australia for at least 3 generations, possibly been in Australia for much longer than that as a family. So this is showing that 48.5% of people are in that third-plus generation, but more than half of the nation were either born overseas or had at least one parent born overseas. So that tells us that Australia is diverse, but we obviously do want to dive in a bit deeper than that. But just before we do, a quick sort of COVID related shout out, and just to say that we are still becoming a more diverse nation as well, in spite of the experience of the last couple of years. So the green here represents pre-COVID and the red represents once COVID has hit. We did see more than 1 million people migrate to Australia over the last 5 years, and obviously the vast majority of that, as you can see on the slide, was 2016 to 2019, and then once COVID hit, everything slowed down. So the 2021 data is not a full year data. We took the census in August 10, so it doesn't reflect the whole year, but very unlikely given where it was at that it was going to go anywhere near even the 2020 results. So definitely a COVID impact there. But we will look a bit more at who did come into the country and what impacts that's had on a number of the things that we measure on the census. So our top 5 countries of birth, England, India, China, Philippines and New Zealand in the nation haven't changed, but there is a change there. India was 4th on the list, but we have seen a strong growth in the number of people born in India over the last 5 years, and they've now moved up to 2nd. Apart from that, this isn't all that much of a story. It's very similar to what we saw in 2016. So if we zoom in a bit, I guess, on some emerging communities and have a look at what has changed over the past 5 years, where more people have come in from different countries, we sort of did a bit of an analysis of where have we seen much bigger both counts and percentage change of communities and from where they're from. And we've highlighted 5 of those communities here. So we have, I guess, we still see India and Philippines on this list. These are larger communities in Australia, but they continue to grow at quite a strong rate. I'll also note that all of these are from the continent of Asia, which is something that we've certainly seen more of, and we'll talk a bit more about that change in the following slides. But Nepal is worth a call out there, more than doubled since the last census. The numbers are relatively small, about 120,000 people compared to almost 300,000 people from Philippines and about 670,000 people from India. And there are other countries that we could have highlighted here. There are certainly other emerging communities that have changed quite a lot, both in terms of counts and in terms of percentage growth. And some of those would be Malaysia, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, and also South Africa that we could have highlighted here as well. So what do we see, well, the effect that this has, I guess, like this Asian migration that we're seeing now, and how has that changed? Well, this tells that story quite well. This is another age-sex pyramid that Duncan was talking about, but it doesn't look all that pyramid-shaped in some of that, and it really tells a very different story of Australian migration. So the orange being the people who were born in a European country, and the, is that cyan? I'll go with cyan. People who are born in an Asian country. And you can really see a large difference in the age profile of those two areas. So we largely saw migration from European nations from the end of the Second World War through to 1975. And then in the last 40 years, we've seen a dramatic shift towards migration from Asia. And given the relatively recent increase in Asian migration, those born in Asia have obviously a younger age profile with a median age of 35 years. That compares to 38 for the whole population. And by contrast, people born in Europe have a median age of 59 years. So that's a very, very large difference. As I said, we'll just highlight a few things that are just sort of below the national level and look at some states. And you do see some differences in terms of where people settle and what we see in terms of top countries of birth around the country. So looking at the most common country of birth here outside of Australia by state, we can see those differences. Certainly, the strong growth in the number of people born in India is apparent in Victoria and the ACT. And in Victoria, it's actually moved into the top spot past England. In WA, South Australia and Duncan's Tasmania, we continue to see England holding the top spot. And in New South Wales, Northern Territory and Queensland, these actually haven't changed since 2016 with China, New Zealand and the Philippines, respectively. But another way of looking at this is back to where we started, I guess, with the first generation and second generation. And we do, noting those differences in European and Asian migration across the country, we still see a lot of diversity in terms of where people were born and people born overseas. So you can see very high numbers there of first and second generation people in Western Australia, noting that it does include a high number of people from England and New Zealand. New South Wales, Victoria and ACT are also all above the national average of around 50% being either first or second generation, whereas Queensland, South Australia, NT and Tasmania are all much lower, with Tassie being a lot lower at only 29%. So how does that affect language? We do collect on the census form languages other than English spoken at home, and we can see these same migration trends playing out with a move from more European languages 30 years ago, as we've presented here, to the more Asian languages over the past 30 years. But we can also see some sort of trends within the trends and stories within the stories here. The older Chinese population predominantly speak Cantonese, whereas the younger population speak Mandarin, and you can see Cantonese was number 3 on the list in 1991, and there was no Mandarin on the list, and now Mandarin has the top spot, and Cantonese is down at number 4. We can also see that even though the languages have shifted and changed quite a lot over that time, we still see about the same proportion of the population speaking other languages than English at home. A few state differences that I'll call out as well as you look at the numbers on the screen. New South Wales saw Hindi within its top languages, and there's about 80,000 people reported that. Victoria and South Australia continued to see Italian and Greek in their common languages. Queensland had about 30,000 people report speaking Spanish at home, and that was in its top 5. And Nepali featured in the top 5 for both ACT and for Tasmania. Northern Territory, in quite a different story, had 2 Aboriginal languages within its top 5. So another part of what we collect on the census, though, is those people who, the English proficiency. So how well do people speak English? And this is showing, even though 1 in 5 people in Australia, more than 1 in 5 people in Australia, reported speaking a language other than English at home, only 15% of these people don't speak English well or at all. But we see an interesting story when we break this down by age. So the graph is showing the proportion of people that speak a language other than English at home who don't speak English well or at all. And it's really obviously important for in-language service delivery and, of course, health services when looking at older populations. The data at the older age brackets potentially reflects older migrants coming to Australia, such as grandparents coming out to join their families in Australia, but it also can be showing some loss of language occurring in the older age brackets. It is obviously a very linear correlation and an interesting thing to explore further. I'm going to get into the religion now and start with this sort of headline slide, which you may have seen before. It's the question on religion has been included in the census, all Australian censuses since 1911, and answering this question has always been optional, but we've still see well over 90% respond to this question, and even more people chose to respond to this question in this census than did in 2016. You can see the decrease here that we've talked about already in people reporting an affiliation with a Christian religion over the past 50 years, now at 44% of the population, as well as an increase in people reporting no religion, which is now more than 38%. It does look very much like these will cross over in the next 5 years, but we'll have to wait and see what the next census holds. And that line at the bottom on other religion, that represents about 2.5 million people reporting an affiliation with a religion not in the Christian bracket. And this was an increase of about 618,000 since 2016. And the main ones there, I think Duncan mentioned, are Islam, Hinduism and Sikhism. But we can, again, look at migration and the impacts of migration on religion. And we can see that in these really interesting pie charts. So looking at the one on the left first, zooming in on those that influence, we first look at the Australian-born population, and you can see about half responded with Christian denomination and around 45% with no religion, so higher than the national average. And the other religions make up a much smaller component. For those born overseas but arriving before 1996, there's far less no religion and a very large Christianity component. And for those born overseas and arriving after 1996, it's about a third Christian, a third other religions, and a third no religion. So very, very different, and it's clear that migration, changes, as well as the migration we're seeing now, is having an impact on what we're reporting and what we're seeing in the overall headline figures here, and really interesting to drill down further. So how is religious affiliation changing over time? This is the top 10 religions that we see, and essentially showing the percentage change in the last two censuses. We can see Hinduism continuing to grow strongly after strong growth between 2011 and 2016. Similar for no religion, and again similar for Islam. We see that that conversely, on the other side, some of the religions that are bigger in Australia declining. So these are all still quite small: Hinduism, Islam, relative to the entire population, but growing fast, and the larger Christian denominations there, that many more people, representing 44%, along with some others that aren't on the slide, are in decline. But we do see the Christian not further defined growing, and that can be related to a few different things. There can be people who report denominations that end up in that because they haven't given us enough information, but it's the vast majority of people whose response end up in that are people who just reported Christian or Christianity on the form, and we have nothing else to put in a denomination, and we see that growing. So that could show some people deciding that they no longer affiliate with a particular denomination specifically, but still do affiliate with the Christian religion. So just a little side note, I guess. The fastest growing religion in Australia in the last 5 years in percentage terms is Yazidism, mostly made up of people from northern Iraq. Religion grew from around 60 people in 2016 to over 4,000 in 2021. And we can see that growth predominantly came from migration in 2017 and 18 as a result of Australia's humanitarian program. And we've seen a rather large community now settled in Toowoomba. So every stat tells a story, and there are stories galore in here for you to explore. One other thing that I'll just quickly note from the slide is in the Eastern Orthodox, and the decline from 2011 to 2016, and then that growth from 2016 to 2021. Have had a look, have tried to pull that apart and understand it more, and there are clearly some changes there, but I am not yet aware of all the drivers. I do believe migration has had an impact there, probably from places like Syria, but haven't fully got to the bottom of all of the numbers there and exactly what is driving a change in the growth there, because we do see, say, Greek Orthodox being the predominant part of the Eastern Orthodox numbers, and that goes back to the European migration that we saw post-war, and so the decline isn't that surprising, but obviously there's changes leading to growth in the last 5 years. So final slide before I hand over to Caroline, and just wanted to show a bit of the story of religion by state and how different it is. You can see again, if you reflect back on the state migration and the changes there, how that could be playing into the stories here in terms of the yellow component that's other religion and how much of that we see in the different states. No religion, and we can compare, say, Tasmania to New South Wales, where Tasmania is nearly half of the population reported no religion. New South Wales, it's just over 30%. But even if you zoom in New South Wales, you see a very different story in Sydney, where it's about 30% of the population said no religion, to, say, Newcastle, where it gets closer, it's well over 40%. So migration being another, just highlighting how much of a difference that does make, but also just cultural differences in the cities and states across Australia. We have released an analytical article on religious affiliation in Australia, so if you want more interesting stories and some more detailed analysis and commentary, then I do recommend taking a look at that on our website. But I am now going to hand over to Caroline to take us through the new topics that were on the census in 2021 and more. Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. I would also like to extend my acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the lands that we are meeting here on today, and to the Turrbal people in my hometown of Brisbane, and every other person who is joining us from lands all across the country. As has been mentioned, I'll press the green button. It's not that hard, did it? Okay, as has been mentioned a couple of times, we were able to include 2 new questions on the census last year. First time since 2006 that we've been able to ask new questions, and I am able to share that data with you today. The first one was on long-term health conditions. Just got a snip of the question up there to just show you it is one simple question. Has the person been told by a doctor or a nurse that they have any of these long-term health conditions? And the person can select multiple health conditions. So they're listed there: arthritis, asthma, cancer, dementia, and so on. From that one question, we have created 30 different variables that you can analyse. We've got variables that give counts of people who have answered to arthritis, to asthma, etc. We also have produced variables that are counts of the comorbidities. So we've got defined comorbidities like lung condition and asthma, for example, or diabetes and heart disease. And we've got a whole lot of variables that relate to the number of conditions that a person has, or the number of conditions that people within the family unit have. So lots of great data to explore. You may know, if you look into health data, as I'm sure our colleagues at the Royal Flying Doctor Service do, the ABS runs a national health survey. That is a very comprehensive collection of information about people's experiences with health and the health conditions that they have. And the census isn't able to replicate that in a single question. What the census can do is really add power to the data by allowing people to look at the census with all the other variables that we do collect on the census. So you can look at experience of these health conditions for very small population groups, for very small geographic areas, maybe for countries of birth or English language proficiency. So you can drill right down into a great deal of detail. I'm going to start by looking at the count data from the census health question. And we had about 30% of people reported having a long-term health condition, or reported having one of those long-term health conditions. And you can see there, 4.8 million had just one, 1.5 million had two, and 800,000 had three or more of those health conditions. This next graph that I've got is long-term health conditions by age. If you have a look at the x-axis there, I'm going up to 100 and over. So I've got breakdowns there all the way up to 70 to 79, 80 to 89, 90 to 99, and 100 and over. A survey set of data cannot give you that level of detail. The patterns are probably what you would expect if we have a look at arthritis there in the dark orange, getting older getting more prevalent as people get older. Asthma in the yellow, we usually think of that as a condition that young people have, but you can see there the reported rate of asthma is remaining fairly constant all the way through into people in their 70s. Dementia is there in that light orange colour. Very little dementia until start to see small counts in the 50s, a little bit more in the 60s, then ramping up as we know in the 70s and beyond. Diabetes also has a later life peak. Diabetes there in the dark green, but still a condition that affects people in their 30s and 40s. And one of a lot of interest is the mental health condition. And you can see there that that's the highest reported condition of all age groups, from people in their 20s, 30s and 40s. Mental health conditions were the most reported condition that people had in the census. And there's still reasonably high numbers of people in their teenage years and right throughout the age spectrum. I mentioned before the National Health National Health Survey, and I should call out that we have produced an article that helps to explain what you'll see in data that you get from the National Health Survey compared to the census, so you know about the strengths of the census data and the limitations, and when you should use census and when you could maybe use the NHS instead. Let's just have a look at the long-term health conditions by sex, and we can see there that arthritis and mental health conditions are much more common in females. Asthma is also higher in females. Diabetes and heart disease are more common in males, and the other conditions are closer in their reporting. The other new question that we asked in the census was service in the Australian Defence Force. We asked about people's current and their previous service in the Australian Defence Force, and we asked both about whether they served in the regular forces or the reserves forces. Again, one question, but one very powerful question. So the numbers. We now know that 2.8% of the Australian population, aged 15 years and over, are either serving or have served in the Australian Defence Force. And the breakdown is on the screen there. About 85,000 are currently serving, and nearly 500,000 people have previously served in the ADF. And this is really interesting data that hasn't been collected before. And the Department of Veterans Affairs provides support to people who have previously served in the Defence Forces. Their current support population is about 247,000. So now we know, we've got some data that shows there are others, there are another couple of 100,000 people who have previously served in our forces that aren't currently receiving support from the Department of Veterans Affairs. And digging into the census, you can find some characteristics of those people. Excuse me, show the age distribution. Okay, as you expect, that we have the orange there is people who are currently serving, they're younger. As you would think, they're in their 20s through to their 30s. The green there represents people who have previously served in the Defence Force. And I do want to have a look at that blip that you see there, 70 to 74-year-olds, a very big cohort. And that can be attributed to the conscription that was operating in Australia between 1962 and 1975. And at that time, 20-year-old men were in a ballot where their birthdays were called and they were potentially being called up to join the army to support efforts in the Vietnam War. And so it's just really amazing when you look at data at that level, just those 5-year cohorts, how that one act of conscription really does stand out. Let me move on now to households and families data. We classify households in the ABS as families, groups or loans, so how people live in their household together. And you can see their families make up about 70% of all Australian households. Lone person households is about a quarter, and then a few percent living in group. This has changed a little bit over time. If I look back to 1991, the family was about 75%. So that's dropped a few percentage points, and it's dropped a few percentage points, and the lone person households were smaller back then, that was about 20, and the group households were about the same. So we are seeing a slight shift away from the family households towards more lone person households. But looking within the family composition, so there were 6.7 million families counted in the census last year. And you can see there the majority of them, 43.7%, were couples with children, nearly 40% couples with no children, and 15.9% was a lone parent family. Now, this has barely changed in the last 5 years since the last census. There was a percentage point decrease in the couples with children and a corresponding increase in couples with no children, but very, very little change, and the lone parent families have remained basically the same over the last 5 years. Same-sex couples is another data item that we can collect from the census. Now, I need to stress here that what we're talking about are people who are living together in a same-sex relationship, and they're reporting on their census form that they're in a relationship that is with another person of the same sex. And we've been able to report that data from 1996. And you can see there that it was less than 10,000, or about 10,000 couples in 1996 were same-sex couples living together. And that's really grown in the last census in 2021. We've got nearly 80,000 couples, same-sex couples. And what I've got there in the orange shading is the number that report their relationship as being husband or wife of the other person. And you can see now, after the changes to the Marriage Act back in 2017, that we've got about a third of all same-sex couples who are living together are now in a husband a marriage relationship. And there were small numbers in 2011 and 2016, that was as they reported them then, but just both a massive growth in the total number of same-sex couples and also the number of same-sex married couples. Okay, this is always a fun slide. I don't know if I get to do this one, but this is about the domestic work. So the data in the census is quite serious, and we have a lot of questions that get a lot of interest, I guess niche type interest, and this tends to be a media favourite. Who does the most domestic work in the household? And surprise, surprise, despite COVID, women are still doing more domestic work than men. If I look on the left of the chart there, the green bar there is males, and nearly 3 million males did no domestic work in the week right before the census. And at the other end of the scale, doing 30 hours or more, there's about 1.4 million females who did 30 hours or more domestic duties in the week before the census. Dwellings. Duncan earlier had a look at the tenure type of the dwellings that we live in, and I'm going to show that over time. So the left of the chart there is 1996, and that's a count on the y-axis of number of dwellings. Okay, so I'm not looking at proportions here, I'm looking at number of dwellings. And what you can see with that dark orange bar is that the number of dwellings that are owned outright has barely changed since 1996. In the last 25 years, it's gone up a little bit in the last 5 years, but just over 2.5 million in 1996, same again in 2016, and just up about 2.8 million in 2021. Obviously, the dwelling stock is growing and has grown in the last 25 years, and we can see that being driven by a lot more owner-occupied tenure types and a lot more rental tenure types. Let me just show that same graph by state and territory and just call out the exceptions there. Northern Territory, very, very high proportion of people renting and very low rates of owner-occupied, potentially due to the more transitory nature of the population. The people who live in Northern Territory don't necessarily stay there for as long. And the only jurisdiction that has owned-occupied as the highest grouping is Tasmania. So just slightly more than a third of people are owner-occupied in Tasmania. And you can see the other patterns there. New South Wales are across the board pretty much the same of all three of those main dwelling tenure types. Income and housing. So we ask about income in the census, and we can report that as the income of the person, the personal income, or the household income, and we also do collect family income, and we do equivalised household income. So a number of income variables are available on the census. So what we saw in this census was that the median personal income, excuse me, increased from $662 excuse me, sorry, $662 to $805. And then we've got the household income in the top row of the chart, and that's a percentage change of 21%. That's about twice the rate of inflation over that 5-year period. Got median mortgage repayments, that's monthly data there, hasn't gone up that much, but I will clarify that when we ask about mortgage repayments on the census, it's not about the minimum that people are required to make, but it is about how much they are paying off their mortgage. So there's a discretionary component to that, or there could be a discretionary component to that. And then rent, we have seen increase just ahead of the rate of inflation. And looking at income by state and territory, and what I've done here is just narrow it down to the population aged between 15 and 64 years to get out some of that age effects that we might see in some of the states. So that adjusts Australia to a median income of $954, and you can see the ACT much, much higher incomes, personal income, than the other jurisdictions. They're followed by WA and South Australia and Tassie coming through as the lowest. that's the last data slide. I'm going to talk just very briefly about what's coming next. And on the 28th of June, we released our first set of data from the census, which was all the topics that we talked about today and some more that we didn't even cover off. So that is all available on the website. We have got another big data release planned for October, and that's when we'll start to see information about labour force, about the qualifications that people have, how people travelled to work, or maybe they didn't travel to work, maybe they went from the bedroom to the spare room via the kitchen. We didn't quite get into that level of detail, but I'm really looking forward to seeing that data item come out. And also internal migration, and that refers to how where people have moved from in the last 1 year and 5 years. So I think when we get to see that data in mid-October, we will see some real COVID impacts there. So looking forward to sharing those stories. And then next year we keep going, we release more data like CFA, the index you might be familiar with, homelessness, and a couple of other products. But in the near term, Mark plugged a couple of times a seminar coming up next Monday where we're going to take a deep dive into the data on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And the address to register at is on the screen there. We also have a range of other seminars and analytical articles planned over the coming weeks. We're going to be doing similar type of data seminars like this one for each state and territory. So where we've only touched on data of interest in states, we're going to be going into what's more unique about each state and territory, and they'll start in late July and they'll be live streamed and recorded. We're going to be releasing in late July a look at the health data, much more deeper look at the health data, and we're going to follow that up with a seminar as well. Mark touched on some of the cultural diversity measures. We're having an analytical article produced in August on that, and again another seminar. And we're not doing our seminar on service with the Australian Defence Force until October, maybe early November, because we think when we see the data that's going to come through in that second release, there's going to be some really interesting stories there. So I'm going to wrap those all together in one big seminar. I will just, most of you are probably familiar with our website, but if you want to find any more data for your own community, we've got search tools available on our website where you can search by your area. So you can look up for your postcode or for your suburb, your local government area, your electoral district, and find some really deep data on those areas. And you can also browse by topic as well. And we have got a fabulous resource, the Census Dictionary. If you want to know more about any of the variables that we've spoken about, every one of them has got an entry in our dictionary, and we define the variable. We talk about the scope, who it applies to, the categories, photographs, snips of the questions that were asked to get that variable, how it's changed over time, and also things like data use considerations, what the item non-response rate might be, and other things that you need to be aware of when you are using that data. So I'd certainly encourage you to look at the dictionary on our website if you want to know more about any of the variables. But now I'm going to hand over to Aoife, who's going to lead us through some questions, and I'm going to invite Mark and Duncan to join me.
Thank you, Caroline. And thank you to our three presenters today for the detailed data insights. My name is Aoife Connors, Director of Census Communication, and I'll facilitate the question and answer session this afternoon. So we'll open up Q&A for 30 minutes from either the live audience here in the room or for those watching the live stream. And this will be an opportunity to ask a question of Duncan, Mark or Caroline, and any general questions about the 2021 census data. For our live stream audience members, you can have your questions included through PollEV, and the address is up on the slide. So we'll take questions from PollEV and from the audience. We'd like to answer as many questions as we can this afternoon in the next 30 minutes, but in the interest of providing everyone with an opportunity to ask a question, we please ask that you try and keep it to one question per person. So we might start with questions here in the room, and we have two of our census staff in the orange shirts with roving mics, ready to hand you the microphone. Don't think we've any questions in the room. Okay, we'll go to Poll EV because we've got lots of questions coming in online. So the first question for our panel: what guidance can the ABS provide to delineate the long-term trends identifiable from Census 2021 versus the results that reflect short-term effects of COVID-19?
They're looking at me, so I'll start first. Yeah, really good question. And as you've heard through the presentations today, often there is a fair bit of work to do to look at the data, to really try and understand and what's happening in the data and what's driving the data. And yeah, you often think afterwards, wouldn't it be great if there was another question in the census which said, well, why did you report that this time around? But some of the things that we do when we're looking at the data is that through that little search interface that Caroline showed before, you can search back every single census back to 1996 through exactly the same interface. So you can look at data over time and see, is there a trend which was already happening? Was there a change here that was already happening? And was what we saw in 2021 something expected based on that trend, or was it something different to what we've seen in the past? Certainly some of the data that we'll release in October, particularly things like the address from 1 year ago and 5 years ago, we think that'll tell a really strong story that'll help you understand some of the COVID impacts on people's living arrangements or living locations. Were people moving back home with family? Were they moving back to we're moving out of a city, etc. So there'll be a bit of data to come through in there. And for those that really want to get into some of the really tricky questions, one of the things in Caroline's last slide that we release next year is the Australian Census longitudinal data set. And so that's a data set now that'll have 4 census points in it where we actually do a longitudinal or linkage of about 5% of a population. And so it's an anonymous process. You can't tell who these people are, but you can see how people have changed the things they've reported on the census now over 4 censuses. So you might be able to see someone who used to live in Brisbane because they love the weather, but now live in Hobart because they love the views. No, sorry, I should stop the Tourism Tasmania ads. But certainly you can sort of see how people have reported differently over time. And so looking at the last 2 data points there between 2016 and 2021 might add more to that kind of story. But we're always really keen to engage and talk to people about what they're seeing in the data, what do we see in other data for the ABS producers, and try and use that to create a better understanding of the stories of Australians.
Thank you, Duncan. Next question. What do you think are the main reasons for the massive growth of Aboriginal ancestry, 414.2% since 2016?
Talk about that. There was a change in the way we collected the census this time around. We actually included Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander as options on the ancestry question on the form, so people could tick those boxes on the form, and that was a change that we made to make the form more inclusive, predominantly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so they could see themselves in the form and respond more easily in that way. But it did have an effect. More people ticked that, and we do see that. So we don't look at that as something that's a change necessarily in Australian culture or for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but something that was more accessible and easier for people to respond in that way. It also was a difference in the online form to the paper form. Obviously, the paper form is static. There's not a lot we can do with that. But with the online form, if someone had identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin, then those options went to the top of that, those response options to make it even more easy for people to find those options. So that would be certainly a main factor in that.
Thank you, Mark.
And I might just expand on that, Mark. So what Mark was mainly talking about today was the origin question or the status question, and that is really the data item. When we're talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that's the data item that should be used. It asks quite simply, are you of Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander origin. What the question was asking about was ancestry, which is more, I guess, more of a subjective concept. So just distinguishing the two there, just plugging our website again, we have written an article that explains, that unpacks the ancestry versus the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin.
Thanks, Caroline. Great addition. The next question, it makes sense that the proportion of baby boomers owning homes is higher than for millennials due to having had many more years to pay off a mortgage. However, do we have any data about whether millennials own property at a similar rate to baby boomers when they were at a similar age?
It's a really, really good question. It was one I was actually thinking about as I was talking about the slides. And so a team in my office gets sick of me because every time they show me a slide, it'll prompt half a dozen new kind of questions I have about what could we understand more here. So it's a great piece of analysis which you'll be able to see using some of our community profiles that was on my website, but certainly something that I'm keen to look at is to wind back a few censuses and try and see what is the ownership rate at different age groups over time. I think it was a bit of a clue in what Caroline presented though earlier, where she showed that actually the total number of houses owned outright in Australia hasn't changed much. It's actually gone up by about 10% in the last 20, 25 years is in the total number of houses owned outright. But the number of houses owned with a mortgage has increased by 100%. And so that we're certainly a lower proportion of the population overall are in the position that they're owning their own home outright over time. So there is some change there, but clearly we all hope that once we get into, if we've got a mortgage, but once we get into older ages, that we've put a good dent in that mortgage.
Thank you, Duncan. Next question. How do you ensure that Australians who are illiterate or not quite proficient in English are able to complete the census? Mark?
So there are a range of things that we do during the field phase. So I'm just trying to think of we certainly do fill in the form sessions, but I know in COVID we weren't able to run as many of those, but we had video presentations and through Facebook and other channels. So I was just trying to remember what the channels were. But we have a long history in the census of running things like that we call fill in the form sessions. We had a partnership with supermarkets where we were able to set up stalls and things, and we certainly work with in-language providers and community groups that have those sort of services. In the past, we've worked with libraries as well, and had the opportunity for people to fill in forms on computers in libraries and things like that. So we do have a range of services that we offer, and we also have phone-in services and other things that we can provide for people and help. For a small proportion of the population, we also do have some interviewer completed, what we call an interviewer completed form, and so we offer that in certain parts where we know that that's going to get a better response and a better result. Yeah, so that's probably...
200 to 300 different languages spoken in Australia last census, and I saw in a great article today highlighting Point Cook in Victoria has 86 different countries of birth in one suburb. And so one of the challenges, obviously, of a census in Australia is just at how rich that diversity is. And so having things like the translator, interpreter service, TIS, phone line that people can phone up to and talk to. We have instructions in sort of the larger language groups in our materials, encouraging people to call up that service and they can help sort of talk through. But what we see in the census is there's a whole lot of family support. It's rare that there's a whole family that don't have people in the family that are very proficient in English. So the children might be helping the parents or the grandparents in the same way as I might help my grandparents with the online form too.
Thank you. Next question. Is there any data comparing the hours spent on domestic tasks by male and female against the hours spent on paid work by male and female, including total hours worked in both paid and unpaid work?
Yes, not just yet though. That will be a question that we can answer in October. So when we release the data related to employment, one of the questions asked was, how many hours did you work last week? So we can then have a look at how that compares to the hours worked at home. The difference is as domestic duties we collect in ranges, so you don't specify exactly that I did 38 hours, but just it was over 30, whereas the hours worked in your employment is a specific number. But yeah, come October, we'll add that to our list of things to have a look at. It sounds like we're getting a request to have a look at the sex difference in people's effort.
Thanks, Caroline. Is there or will there be guidance on the use of the ABS Data API to access census data?
Yeah.
So, well, it's a good plug to start with.
Yeah,
I'm looking at the program
do.
manager in the front
Thanks
row.
for that.
Oh, I'm sorry, the thumbs up. Yes, we get. Yes, there will be.
We do have the data available in aggregated form available through an API, and so you'll be able to find some details on that, but certainly there's contact information there on how you can reach out and request sort of some extra service. I know that people do use those APIs to feed into other websites or also into their own decision-making kind of systems of their work. So it is a popular way of accessing our data, as well as the web pages, as well as the spreadsheets, as well as the articles, as well as the data packs you can download. There's so many different products there.
Thank you. When are mesh block population and dwelling counts expected to be released? Caroline?
I am pretty sure they're already up. Yes, I think they came out on the 28th of June. They might not have been there at 10 a.m, but they would have been there within half an hour, an hour.
Okay, perfect. Next question. Will we be able to see health data correlated with ethnicity or language?
Yeah, absolutely. So all that data is already available. We've had to play around with that. We'll see some of that in the health article that comes out later this month, but then you can go in and play with it yourself. What I observe when looking at that data is you often have to take out the age effect of what you're observing there. So, for example, we said earlier that the highest growth, one of the highest growth countries of birth for recent migrants was Nepal. And what we see when we look at the health conditions reported against people who are born in Nepal is that they have the highest rate of reporting no health conditions. And so that sounds very interesting, but then we also look at the age, and they are a younger, much younger population. I would contrast that with maybe people who are born in Greece who are reporting higher levels of long-term health conditions. Again, we have a look at the age profile there, and that could be due to the Greek population in Australia predominantly being older. But yes, that data is all there, and I think that just shows the real power of the census, that we can take the health conditions data and have a look at it by country of birth, by ancestry, by language, by English language proficiency. I think that's going to be really important for delivering health services, not just whether someone uses a language other than English at home, but whether they don't speak English well at all.
Thank you, Caroline. Next question. Will we get commuting data? And if we do, how will it compare to the previous census, given COVID and lockdowns, etc.?
So that is in our second release in October, part of our journey to work data. That's the commuting data, what we call it. And we can't talk yet about exactly how that will compare because we haven't released the data and we've still got more work to do there. But I'm certainly expecting that we will see impacts of lockdowns around the country around census time. The question's quite specific. It asks, how did you get to work on census day? And so it's asking people to reflect on that specific day, and that is how the question should have been answered by the population. So we would expect to see a big difference in places that were in lockdown specifically on census day. So when we talk about half the country being in lockdown around census time, not half the country was actually in lockdown on census day. But COVID still was impacting the way people chose to work and were choosing to work from home, choosing to or not to catch public transport. So I do expect we'll see those sorts of things coming through in the data. Interesting will be to see things like how many people still travel to work even in a lockdown and go and commute to somewhere that's not their home. because that's what their job required, even through the lockdown. So there is, even in the lockdown environment, I think we'll still see a lot of interesting stories and a lot of interesting things to take from that data.
And I think we'll just add to that we had a question earlier about what we might see the impact of COVID on the data, and this is one that we are keenly aware of. We know that data is used by transport planners around the country, particularly in the major cities, to understand road infrastructure development, public transport infrastructure. So we have been talking with key transport planners at the Commonwealth level and state and territory levels for some time to look at additional data sources, or talk about additional data sources that might support their planning needs into the future, because I think we can probably conclude now, without seeing the data, that the commuting situation in August 2021 was quite different to what it was in August 2016, but none of us can predict what it's going to be in August 2026. Is there a move away from commuting into our big cities? We don't know that yet, but we'll find out more come the October release.
Thank you, Caroline. Next question. Will an LGBTQI plus question be added to the next census?
I could probably take that one. This is data items that are of real interest, and we don't. I took us through the number of same-sex couples who live together and reported that for the last 5 censuses, but we don't currently have any questions that relate to gender identity, relate to sexual orientation, or relate to intersex status. In the lead up to this census, as we always do, we ran a consultation process to find out from the community, from data users, what we should add to the census, and that's where the suggestion of the health and the service with the Australian Defence Force came from. But we also did hear from the community at that time interest in collecting LGBTI data, and we did do a lot of assessment of how we could collect those questions. Ultimately, though, what goes on the question is decided by the government, and there is restrictions, I guess, or constraints on how many questions we can add to the census. So I think when we did our consultation process, we got something like 450 submissions. We're not going to ask that many extra questions on the form. So we did hear in the lead up to the 21 census great interest in the LGBTIQ related questions being included. Work that has happened within the ABS more recently is looking at what we call the standard for how you would collect data for variables such as sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, and we have recommended wording if you're to collect that data. And those questions are being rolled out in some of our other surveys. So they're not on the census yet, but we're currently doing surveys on mental health, we're doing surveys on health, and those questions are being asked in those surveys. To conclude on that, the question was, will it be in the 2026 process? I expect that we will, as we go through consultation, again hear interest in that, and we'll again assess it, and we'll see in 5 years' time where we're at with that.
And so that process of consultation, we'll start doing some engagement later this year, and then there will be a public consultation process open next year, and so really keen to hear from people about both the value of current questions in the census and whether or not they need change, as well as new potential topics. And it's very much, as Caroline highlighted, a process of us listening to the community, us trying to apply our statistical expertise into how you could collect different data, and then making recommendations to government so that the government can make the decisions for 2026. And those decisions are usually made a couple of years out from a census in order to have enough time to create all the forms and finalise the online forms and test everything. So, we should have an answer in about 2024.
We have a question that might be best directed at Frank from the Royal Flying Doctors. How can we access Royal Flying Doctors data, and is this available for LGAs? Do you want to pop up?
Thank you. And it might not be a direct answer to the question, but we publish a vast quantity of research papers, often either ourselves or in partnership with other services that we provide. It's a bit of a complex matrix that we have because we have reporting requirements to state governments, and some of that data is confidential to state governments. We have other requirements that require us to report to Commonwealth Government, and some of that data is confidential to Commonwealth Government. We also face some of the challenges that I'm sure the census people face about very small populations in very localised areas, and sometimes that can make it very difficult for us to publish information too. But certainly we're very happy in collaborating on research projects where it's possible to, so please reach out to us. And as I said, there's a vast quantity of papers that are being produced each year that make as much of that information available. Sneak preview, we're rebuilding a report that we published some years ago called Best for the Bush, and we're likely to publish that in the next quarter. And that report really will bring together as much of the current data from our own data and other sources as we can bring together in order to paint a picture of what we think rural and remote health issues are looking like right now.
Thank you, Frank. Next question. Given the recent statements by the new Minister for Immigration, can ancestry as a variable be considered an effective measure of ethnicity and/or race identities across the Australian population? And if not, does the ABS have plans to address this?
Okay, so I think we have had a lot of interest in the census from the new Minister for Immigration and the question about ancestry. And I think ancestry, as I mentioned, is a bit of a confusing concept. What is your ancestry? How far back do you go? And so there is a question, should that be ancestry? Should that be ethnicity? And so that's something that we will explore over the coming years as part of our development work for the 2026 census. But I think what was shown in the breadth of Mark's presentation was that when we are looking at cultural diversity, we weren't looking at just one measure. In fact, I don't think we even talked about ancestry in the presentation today. So we're collecting things like country of birth of your mother, country of birth of your father, the language, your religion, as well as your ancestry. And when you join those various data points together, that's when you get a richer picture of someone's cultural background. And so I think ancestry as a substitute for ethnicity is just part of that picture. We've got to look more broadly at the range of questions that we do ask. We work quite closely with our international colleagues who run censuses in a similar format to Australia, and everyone handles this question different. I've had a look at it again quite recently, sometimes like in the UK, they talk about race and they talk about white and black and terminology that's just not really used within our society. So we need to work through what's the best way to get data that's fit for purpose for the Australian community.
I'll just quickly add to that in terms of the presentation today. Duncan talked about asking more questions and wanting more data, and we're all a bit in that boat. I'm really sort of interested and haven't unpacked yet the 48% that we talked about that were 48.5%, I think, that responded as third or more generation Australians, and what the ancestry of those people are that they reported, and how much diversity is still within that, because we presented that as almost the less diverse part of Australia or something like that, but it may not be. And so pulling that apart with a question like ancestry allows us to see into that and see more. But absolutely agree that it's part of the topic consultation and thinking about what's the best way to collect this information for Australia.
Thank you, Mark. There's a lot of talk about the impact of COVID on the data. Is there any thought from the ABS about conducting a more COVID-specific survey in regards to to find out more about the impacts of COVID on Australians?
Yeah, nice question. I thought the question was going to be any thought of running a census again now, and it's like, okay, one every 5 years is probably about our limit. The ABS has actually run a series of surveys called the Household Impacts of COVID-19, and so it was actually a series that right near the start of a pandemic, we started running we were collecting data every fortnight for a series of time to measure. And it measured some of the impacts of health measures in place, so wearing of masks and social isolation, etc., but also then got into topics of social connection and employment and a whole range of different areas. And so that series, we ran for a period of time, and then we ran it again near the start of this year during the sort of Omicron outbreak. And so certainly there's a real richness of data there, but also the back catalogue of other ABS surveys and collections all produce some really rich kind of pictures. We've got our survey of mental health and wellbeing is due to come out in the not too distant future, and so that's an in-depth look at the mental health of Australians and right across the country. It's been collected in a couple of waves over the last couple of years, and so go to the ABS website. Warning, like if you like data like me, you might never come out again, but go to the ABS website and there's a whole lot of information there.
Thank you. We probably have time for one more question, and it's probably one for all three of the panel members. What has been your favourite story told by the census?
I'm going to start so that we don't all take the same one. Look, I did speak about the service with the Australian Defence Force, and I think the inclusion of that question has been such a positive thing for the census, and I shared a couple of facts about people who have served with the Australian Defence Force. Some other things that I didn't go into were where people are living. And so we know that Townsville, so I'm from Brisbane, we know Townsville is a very defence-centric town. So there's a lot of currently serving Defence members who are living in Townsville. But what we also see is that after they leave the forces, they don't leave Townsville. So Townsville has got a really large community of people who are ex-Defence Force. And if I contrast that with somewhere like Canberra, where there is a lot of currently serving people, but then they go elsewhere when they finish their service. So I think, anything around the Defence Force topic, I think, is really fascinating.
Caroline definitely did take mine, so the question is favourite, and now I can't talk about that. But other things that I have certainly found really interesting, and I talked a lot about it, is some of those growth communities and seeing where people are settling from different countries, where they've migrated and where they're settling in communities. They move into places that are, where they first go and then where they eventually settle as a community. I mentioned briefly Toowoomba as something we saw come into the media this week for the Yazidis people from northern Iraq. That is an interesting story, but there's so many stories like that. We saw the Nepalese coming into Tasmania and a change in the people from Nepal and a change in the language there in the top 5 languages, and just seeing those sorts of stories and communities emerge in different parts, regional and in capital cities, I do find really, really interesting. But I mean, I don't want to trade off one piece of data over another and one story over another, but I do love that we have that veteran data set and the service opportunities that provides, and seeing information come out from Department of Veteran Affairs around how many people are accessing services compared to how many people we counted in the census in that population. I think that's really interesting and some real opportunities there.
It does feel like trying to choose your favourite child to me. I think thinking about what Frank got us to look at before with all of the Royal Flying Doctor aeroplanes, and I'll definitely be looking at again flying in Australia, but reflecting on the fact that, in 2016, 600,000 Australians were zipping around overseas, and then having 550,000 of those Australians back in the country at census time. That surprised me. Both those numbers sort of surprised me, and that the fact that really seeing that 2 million more people at home on census night than we saw in 2016. I think that's probably one of the ones that I'm really interested in.
Thank you, Duncan. And just one last comment on the Poll EV. Someone asking when will the dates be confirmed or published for the State and Territory data seminar series. So just keep an eye on the ABS website for details, and we'll be confirming all those dates in the next few days. So that brings the 2021 Census National Data Seminar to a close. We obviously had more questions today than we have time for this afternoon, but if you have had a question submitted online that we didn't get to, you're welcome to contact the ABS by email at client.services@abs.gov.au, and we'll get back to you shortly. For any journalists in the audience today or online virtually, please contact the Census Media team via email media@abs.gov.au, and we'll respond to you directly. I'd like to thank our three presenters for their time and insights that they have shared today, and to let you know that today's presentation has been recorded and it will be available on the ABS website and YouTube channel. Afternoon tea is now provided outside the room, and I invite you all to please make your way out and to enjoy afternoon tea with us before you depart. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.